I'm not going to go into huge detail of all these sort of facts and so, but as I wanted to mention some different years and names of treaties, I thought it's easier if I actually put a few slides up. So then I'll take them down again in a minute, and we can then also discuss a bit more freely if you have questions and comments and so. But first, the thing to say about space law, and I'm sure some of you listening know this, but or maybe all of you because you're all space people, but I find that many people are actually a bit surprised that there is something even called like space law, or there is any legal aspects of outer space that are actually sort of properly established, or how to put it. And the people who are surprised can be both lawyers who don't work with space, or space people who don't work with law. And I think the reason why people are surprised is quite understandable, that it is such an sort of international area. It is still quite exotic. So how is it possible to make any rules and laws for something like that? But actually there is quite a lot of space law. So it's quite established as a legal area. And interestingly enough, you can almost give it an exact birthday, the 4th of October 1957. And I'm sure everybody in this forum will know that date. It's the first satellite launched. And why I'm mentioning it as the birthday of space law is because before that, there was hardly even any speculation about the legal side of space. This really illustrates just how surprised the international community really was when the first satellite was launched. Because it otherwise you will see with other questions that you start having, say, academics discussing, speculating and so on. Of course, there was a little bit of that, but not much. So there was a real explosion in the development of space law when the first satellite was launched. And the interesting thing there was that the countries at first, as you well know, was the space powers were really only the Soviet Union and the United States. And this was a Cold War period. The relationship was not good between the superpowers, but they actually managed to agree on principles of space law. And this was done in the framework of the United Nations. So it meant that also other countries could actually participate to develop principles of space law, which is in a way the way international law should happen, but often doesn't. And unfortunately, it's no longer like that, that there's no longer any sort of goodwill in trying to do things in space, irrespective of what the relationships look like on Earth. That kind of dynamic has ended. Why it was possible then? Probably because it was seen as something exotic. It was seen as something that would mainly be of interest for science and research. And also, I think, important that neither side knew exactly what the other ones were up to. And if you create some rules and laws, then yes, you limit perhaps yourself a little bit, but at the same time, at least you know what the framework is for sort of activities. So anyway, the first steps were UN General Assembly resolutions. These are not legally binding, but if there is no legally binding law on that topic, this resolution is nevertheless very important. So in 1963, there was a declaration on legal principles for the activities in space, which set out the main legal principles that are still valid. And to just very briefly sort of mention them, it's that space cannot be appropriated, but it can be used by any states, and it can also be used by private companies. It's sometimes in the debate, you almost get the impression as if these private firms that are now doing things in space have just kind of started doing it, but it's actually foreseen already in the early laws and principles that private activities can happen, but the state is responsible for its subjects. The use of space should be for the benefit of mankind. And then there are certain more principles on cooperation and so, but this is really the core, that it cannot be appropriated, but it can be used in the benefit for mankind. The same principles as in the declaration, a bit more detail, were set out in the what usually is just called the Outer Space Treaty from 1967. And it has today 112 parties. And it's also regarded, even by those countries who for some reason haven't signed it, to illustrate the main principles of space law. So those principles have also become what's called customary law, which is the other main source of international law. And then there were a number of other treaties on more specific topics, and that was always the idea, that this outer space treaty would be supplemented by more specific rules in other international agreements and in national law. And as for other international agreements, that worked more or less as intended. So on the rescue and return of astronauts, on liability, on registration of space objects, and then the last one, the agreement, usually just called the Moon Agreement, the agreement on activities of states on the moon and other celestial bodies. That is the only one of these agreements that is regarded as being sort of irrelevant. It has very few parties and no space powers are parties to it. It's also the only one that took quite a long time to enter into force, to even get enough parties to enter into force. The other different agreements are seen to be relevant, even if they don't have as many parties as the Outer Space Treaty. It's popular to discuss whether this body of law is perhaps already obsolete because it's already quite old. But most space lawyers, I think, would say that it's actually not obsolete, the Outer Space Treaty especially. But one reason why not is because it really is just principles. It's very general, so there's not much detail. And this means that, okay, the principles can stay, but it still means that we don't have clear answers on very many questions. And actually, a kind of characteristic of outer space law is that there are many unresolved questions that sort of remain on the table and aren't solved. And you can see here a little picture of my PhD thesis. And indeed, this question, whether activities in space, whether it is appropriation or use, is one of these unresolved questions. As I said, I defended my thesis in 1999. It's nearly 25 years ago. And of course, I'm not the only one, by far, I'm not the only one who's discussed this question. And it's still an open question. Maybe the most interesting open question is actually where outer space begins, which is not answered in a legal sense. There's no rule on that. It's been on the table for the UN Committee of Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which was created in 58, made permanent in 59. It's been on their agenda ever since 59, or 58 even, and it's still not solved. And it's very interesting for lawyers that it's not solved because the legal regime of airspace is actually completely different. Airspace belongs to the states under it, and there is no right to fly through anybody else's airspace unless you give them permission to do it. And in outer space, it's different. Anybody can use it. So we don't know where the limit is. As for this use and appropriation, in common usage, the terms may sound quite different. You know, you use something or you take it to be yours. But in space, we see many examples where this distinction in reality is not that clear. For instance, now we have these mega constellations. And if you imagine that certain orbits are so filled up with satellites of somebody, then is it really much left of this idea that it's not been appropriated, it's just being used? So this question is also something that is getting increasingly more relevant. And of course, also this whole idea of benefit for mankind, what does that mean? And who should determine it? In this Moon Agreement, the one that's sort of regarded as irrelevant, there was the attempt to set up a system by which there would be an international body to determine benefit of mankind when somebody was using resources in the moon, for instance. But this system was never set up. Some of you may be familiar with that there's such a system for the deep seabed, which is set up, but also not regarded as very relevant perhaps, but this idea that you have a system by determining benefit for mankind. So for the space, that doesn't exist. What we see now with more and more activities in space and more private activities is that it probably will not be possible to just have these questions that are never solved. It's been possible because again, this international law side of it, that states, if they are the main actors, and if there is no clear legal framework, then you solve things, in a sort of say through diplomacy and so on. You can kind of have these situations where it's not exactly clear what applies, but people sort of know it. But for private business to invest lots of money, space is still expensive. You want something better than just the kind of feeling it's probably like that. So what's happening is with more actors, law takes on a different role. It doesn't stay as this kind of background or so, but we actually need concrete legislation. And of course, then what has happened is that this, let's say, definition or specification of the international space law through national law is really taken off. And there's, I could have listed lots more countries here, because in the past sort of 10 years or a little bit more, but about 10 years especially, in Europe only, I think there are some, say, 12 countries have passed new space laws in this period. The last one who have passed their law, I think, last year, or whether it's still in the process of being passed, is Slovenia. Norway and Sweden were among the few countries who actually passed space laws relatively early. Otherwise, this idea that the international law would be made more specific through national law, it didn't really work, because a country like the US had a lot of space law from the beginning, but many countries again felt it's probably too far in the future where it will have practical use. So that's really changed. And that means that those countries with these early laws that were very short, didn't really say much at all, like Norway and Sweden, they're now then changing those, and other countries are passing space legislation. So final slide, and then I will end soon, and we can also have, if you have questions and comments, but I will then come back a little bit to my work in space and how this has changed. And I'm now taking Estonia as an example, because this is where I now live for the last 20 or so years. I lived on and off here also earlier, but and this is also where my space work has actually mainly been happening. And also, I think, because this is an example which could be relevant for many countries on actually how it sort of changed from being perhaps something very exotic, at least for small countries that don't have huge space industries themselves, but how space has actually become something that is relevant and creates sort of work activities for people. Estonia launched its first satellite, a small CubeSat, on the 7th of May in 2013. This happens to be my 50th birthday, completely by coincidence. So that was a nice coincidence. It was actually supposed to be launched a little bit earlier, and as often happens, was a bit delayed. So I got that as a birthday present. Perhaps more importantly for my work with space was that Estonia became a full member of the European Space Agency in 2015. As I'm sure you know, in Europe, space has really been handled in European cooperation ever since the beginning. No European country has a huge space presence by itself, with we could possibly say exception of France, but otherwise it's been through the European Space Agency. So this is again an example of how this sort of regional cooperation that Europe is quite good at means that all kinds of countries, even a small country, can actually play a role. So anyway, what I was asked to do in the ESA context was to be the Estonian representative in the International Relations Committee. And then I was actually elected chairman of that committee, which I was for those 3 years that you're allowed to be chair. So until 2020. What is also, talking about European cooperation happening with space, especially again in the last less than 10 years, actually, maybe about 7 or 8 or so, is that the European Union has taken a completely different interest in space than what they did before. They've been interested in space and as a sort of user of space for quite a long time. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Galileo positioning system or the Copernicus remote sensing. So they're both European Union projects. But since about, well, from about 2013, so 10 years ago, so, but sort of on and off in that period, there's been more discussion of whether the EU should pass its own space legislation and maybe create its own space agency. And so discussions with ESA how this would work. European Space Agency is not an EU body. It has almost the same membership, but not quite, and it's not formally linked to the EU. So I had one possibility of also working directly with the EU space law, which was very interesting. I was the expert advisor to a rapporteur in the Committee of the Regions, which is the EU body that comments on regional aspects of different EU policies. And I think this is also interesting to mention, again, not just because it was my work, but it also shows how these questions like, for regional industry or how you can benefit from space activities is kind of becoming more real, that now those bodies that do not deal specifically with space at all, like the Committee of the Regions, take an interest. So. And also there's something called the European Interparliamentary Space Conference to make parliamentarians aware of space, so politicians aware of like why space is relevant. And there, when Estonia had the chairmanship of that committee, we had a lot of different events, conferences and so to try to raise the interest among politicians, which is still a bit of a struggle actually, because politicians obviously have to think about votes, and for voters, perhaps for many, space still seems so exotic, so they will be met with the criticism, like, are we now so rich we can throw money into space? And so to try to explain that no, actually space is interesting for the uses of it. So it's like quite challenging. And another aspect, of course, where space is coming in a big way is in connection with cyberspace, and also in all kinds of connections of, say, cyber attacks or other attacks. And here we had a very interesting project with my university, which we reported on just before Christmas, which was a study for the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on whether self-defense Article 5 of NATO's Treaty on Collective Self-Defense applies in space, and that in relation with cyberspace. So we did that small team of myself and a PhD student in space law and 2 cyberspace experts. And there's a similar project at the moment. The German Space Agency is planning to write a commentary on these aspects of sort of cyberspace and outer space, where I'm also involved in this working group. And then the final thing I'll mention is that we have just started drafting a space law in Estonia. We haven't had one before, and I'm a member of a working group that's not drafting the law, but we're looking at the draft, which will be presented by a law firm, because in Estonia it's quite common to buy in the sort of actual legal drafting. So suddenly I found myself working a lot on outer space, and this is a real treat, because say I've been interested in it for a long time, and before it was something that it was kind of like, side activity or so, and now it's suddenly actually become an important part of the daily work. And I think I'll pretty much wrap up now, but I'll maybe just say that other developments that I'm seeing here, like how it's becoming more of part of the daily work also of legal people. One is from the academic side, where now every year there are some students at different levels who want to to write their thesis on space. I'm at the moment supervising 2 PhDs, one here at my own university and one at the University of Helsinki. I'm co-supervising on space law. But also law firms are beginning to have space law related questions. So lawyers who work on commercial law find themselves sort of coming to ask about space. And so often in say contract law or these kind of regular legal questions, but suddenly space has become something that is not so exotic as was thought before. But I think I'll stop here.